Hi, this is Eve from Tarot Stack. Today we're going to talk about the Moon Power Tarot deck. As you can see, it comes in a lovely two-piece box, and it has a small guidebook that's very much in Rider-Waite Smith style. So for this deck, I find that instead of referencing the guidebook, I think this is a really good deck to read intuitively with. So I just wanted to walk through this deck with you, and we can talk about some interesting interpretations that I see, and maybe it'll spark your creativity. You'll also get a chance to see every card in the deck. So if you're interested, come find us at tarotstack.com and we can get you hooked up. So first card is the Fool. This is a pretty standard Rider-Waite Smith type deck, in the sense that it has our major arcana and our minor arcana, and we have cups, swords, pentacles, and wands. So nothing fancy here, but the imagery is very interesting. As you can see, as we go through, it's largely female identifying focused, and most of these ladies are pretty badass. They're just living their best lives. So when I read this deck, I look at some of this alternative imagery. For the Fool, there's one thing that I look at here that I don't really see in many tarot decks, and that is a television. So that's something that, sometimes people can be addicted to television, or they're having problems with the television. There's too much. That's something that's always good to have. And I haven't really seen that come up in other decks. For the Magician, if you notice, she has a crystal wand. So often that can talk about people who like using crystals for their magic work. See, the High Priestess here is reading a book. So that's always good for contemplation. The Empress here, you can see there is the ocean in the background. So I really identify with the ocean being female. It kind of also makes me think of the moon. You don't see the moon here, but it makes you feel like maybe the Empress is like the moon herself, and she is dictating the tides. Have the Emperor here, and he has kind of this astronomy chart in the background. So with the Empress being the ocean and the Emperor being the stars, I think that's an interesting analogy. Here we have the Hierophant, which is normally, a depiction of a priest, but instead we have a coven. So I really like that interpretation, because it talks about sharing your religious and spiritual beliefs with your friends rather than having that being dictated to you. I like the analogy in the Lover's card where you're sparking each other's fire. The Chariot, this can reference the fact that sometimes when you're motivated to do something, but it's new, it makes you feel small. So you can see how the lady is so tiny. It can also be helpful for referencing when people have pest problems or infestations in their house, which I've never really seen a deck reference that either. For the Strength card, we have her riding the tiger. In the Thoth decks, this card is actually called Lust. So I thought that's kind of a funny analogy with riding the tiger, Lust. It's a good one. Hermit, again, we have a book here, but you can tell since the book is like hiding her face that she's hiding behind the book. I thought that was a nice analogy. Wheel of Fortune makes you think that it's a balancing act as time passes. Justice, very pretty card. I like that there's the feather and the heart, and it talks about, that's a reference to, I believe, the Egyptian belief that once you die, they will weigh your heart, and if it's lighter than a feather, then you'll be allowed to go to the good underworld. Well, that's my understanding. I'll have to find a reference for that, but I think that's what that's referring to. Hanged Man, this is pretty standard. I didn't really find anything unusual in this card. Same with Death. It's a pretty standard interpretation. Temperance. I actually thought this was really cool because it's about a meeting of the minds. Temperance was one of the cards that I always had a hard time with at first, because a lot of people describe it as like alchemy, but I think really this card embodies how I use temperance now, where it's like two different concepts coming together to create something new. So I really like the imagery on this card. The Devil, I really like this card because if you look closely, there's little evil eyes all over her dress. So this card to me not only means the standard definition of the devil, but it can also mean someone giving you the evil eye, or alternatively, protection from the evil eye. The Tower, pretty standard. The Star. The Moon. At least on this card, you don't have the standard imagery of the wolf and the dog, but you do have the little crayfish on this person's deck. So that's very nice. And you can see that she, he, they is emerging from the water. The Sun. Something that I find interesting about this card is even though the sun is the sun, it's still in a very dark sky and there's clouds all around. So that to me says that happiness isn't always all sunshine and rainbows. Sometimes you have to choose to be happy when there is some darkness and clouds around you. Judgment. I think this is a lovely card talking about ascension through the different dimensions. I normally think of Judgment as a transition card where you're moving from one stage of life to another and you're being weighed and then redirected on your path. But I do like this idea of interdimensional travel through the different realms. And some people can see that as ascension, moving between the various dimensions. The World. This is a great one because in the normal world card, you have the lady floating in air and the angels looking down upon her. But this one, she's actually holding the world in her hands. So this feels a little bit more empowering to me because she's looking at the world rather than being a naked woman having, some people look at her. All right, so that was the majors. For the rest of the deck, we're just going to go through the cups and the wands and the pentacles and the swords. We're not going to stop at each card, but I'm going to show each one to you. A lot of the imagery here is pretty standard, although what I do enjoy is that it's a little bit of a hunt sometimes to find things. So you can see the two cups on the lapel of their shirt. So that's fun. The only thing I would have to say though is that because the imagery is slightly alternative, if you do want to read this deck, like a Rider-Waite Smith deck, you have to know your definitions because you're not going to be able to tell based on the card itself. So if you want to use it as a traditional tarot deck, I would brush up before you pick it up. Now we have the swords. Again, lots of interesting imagery for the Six of Swords. This is very, very different from what I would consider like a normal Six of Swords card. But it's definitely interesting because you can tell that this person is very alternative, like who has a snake as a pet and is walking them on a leash. So that does remind me of kind of being able to get away from troubling times where you're worried about being different or feeling different. onto the wands. Wands are my favorite suit, personally. I feel like they're very exciting. In particular, I actually really like the wands in this deck because it reminds me of Sailor Moon. Who doesn't love a little Sailor Moon? I mean, come on. This is my favorite card, personally. Finally, Pentacles. So this one's kind of cool. It's an eyeball. The other thing I like about this deck is these cards are firm, but they are not too thick. I really do enjoy decks that have nice thick plush cards, but that means that this deck is significantly easier to shuffle. I have average size hands, but I know for a lot of people with smaller hands, some of these decks can be really hard to shuffle, especially the large ones that are 5 by 3.5. So this one is very nice to shuffle. The cards are a good width, and they have a nice feel. They're easy to shuffle. Well, that is my review of this deck. I think it's really good for intuitive reading. It's nice to shuffle. It comes in a pretty box, and it has lots of cool female empowered imagery. So I love it. If you have any other thoughts on the intuitive imagery and want to share, please add them to the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. And you can find this deck on tarotstack.com. Thanks. See you later.